You are lying face down in a world of blinding, frozen white. The temperature has plummeted to -40, a cold so absolute it feels less like weather and more like a physical weight pressing against your lungs. Your fingers are numb inside your mittens, yet they remain perfectly steady on the cold steel of your Mosin-Nagant M2830. Through the iron sights, you see a group of Soviet soldiers huddled around a small fire, their dark uniforms like ink stains on a clean sheet of paper. They are shivering, exhausted, and completely unaware that they are being watched by a shadow they cannot see. You take a small handful of snow and shove it into your mouth. The ice stings your tongue, but you hold it there, chilling your breath so that not even a puff of white vapor escapes your lips to betray your position. The bolt of your rifle clicks a tiny sound, swallowed by the howling wind, as you align the iron sights with a target 400 meters away. You don't use a scope. The glass would catch the sun and turn you into a target, and you refuse to give the Red Army that satisfaction. You exhale slowly, pull the trigger, and before the sound of the shot even echoes off the frozen pines, another invader falls silently into the drift. This is exactly what happened to Simo Häyhä, a humble Finnish farmer, starting in November 1939, in the brutal wilderness of the Kala region. To understand how Simo became the deadliest sniper in human history, we have to look at the world that created him. He wasn't a product of a prestigious military academy or a high-tech weapons program. He was a man of the earth, born in the small hamlet of Rotjärvi near the Russian border. By the age of 33, Simo had spent his entire life hunting in these woods and farming the rugged land, developing a preternatural patience and a marksman's eye that would soon haunt the dreams of Joseph Stalin's generals. When the Soviet Union launched the Winter War on November 30th, 1939, they expected a victory within weeks. They brought 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, and a massive air force to crush the tiny Finnish resistance. What they didn't account for was the White Death, a man who blended so perfectly into the landscape that he seemed to be a part of the winter itself. Simo didn't just join the army. He brought his life skills to the front lines, carrying the same bolt-action rifle he used for hunting foxes and birds. As the Red Army marched into the dense forests of Kala, they found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. Simo was waiting for them, hidden in a hole he had dug in the snow, wearing a heavy white camouflage suit that made him invisible against the drifts. He knew every ridge, every frozen creek, and every shadow of the forest, and he was about to turn the Finnish wilderness into a graveyard for the invaders. The first few days of the invasion were chaotic, but as the bodies began to pile up with surgical precision, the Soviet commanders realized they weren't just fighting a militia, they were fighting a ghost. Simo Häyhä's journey to the front lines didn't begin with a grand patriotic speech, but with the quiet necessity of a man protecting his home. Before the first Soviet shells whistled through the Finnish air, Simo was known as a quiet, unassuming man who stood barely 5 feet tall. His neighbors in the Karelia region knew him as a master hunter who could track a deer through the thickest brush and hit a target from distances that seemed impossible for a common rifle. When the mobilization orders arrived, Simo didn't reach for a modern weapon. He grabbed his Finnish-made M2830, a shorter, more rugged version of the Russian Mosin-Nagant. This rifle was his tool, an extension of his own arm, and he had spent years mastering its iron sights in the variable light of the northern forests. While other soldiers complained about the lack of telescopic sights, Simo saw them as a death sentence. A scope meant he would have to lift his head 3 centimeters higher above the snow, exposing the crown of his skull to enemy countersnipers. He knew that at -40, the glass of a scope would fog or frost over, rendering a marksman blind at the most critical moment. Instead, he relied on the Civil Guard sights he had used since he was a teenager, trusting his eyes and his intimate knowledge of ballistics. He understood how the freezing, dense air of the Finnish winter would pull at a bullet, and how the wind whipping through the pines would try to push it off course. As his unit moved to Kola the Kola River, the reality of the war set in. It was a battle of thousands against tens of thousands. The Soviet Red Army advanced in massive columns, confident that their sheer numbers and heavy tanks would shatter the Finnish lines. But the terrain of Kola was a nightmare for a mechanized army. It was a land of narrow tracks, deep bogs, and snow that reached a man's waist. Simo watched from the shadows as the Soviet tanks grew bogged down in the drifts, their engines groaning and failing in the extreme cold. He realized that the forest was no longer just a landscape. It was a weapon, and he was the one who knew how to wield it best. While the Russian soldiers wore dark olive-drab uniforms that stood out like targets against the white backdrop, Simo was a ghost in a bleached white parka. He spent his first nights on the front, not just fighting, but preparing his nests, carefully chosen positions that offered a wide field of fire and multiple escape routes. He would spend hours before dawn packing down the snow in front of his position until it was as hard as ice. This wasn't just for comfort. He knew that the muzzle blast from a high-powered rifle would kick up a cloud of loose snow, instantly revealing his location to any observer. By freezing the snow in front of him, his shots remained clean, leaving no visual trace in the air. He also brought a small bag of dry bread and sugar to keep his energy up, knowing he might have to remain motionless for 12 hours straight. The discipline required was superhuman: to lie in a drift of ice, heart rate slowed, waiting for the exact moment when a Soviet officer would step into the light. Simo wasn't looking for glory. He was looking for the most effective way to stop an army that threatened his village. As the first week of December came to a close, the Simo Häyhä the world would remember began to emerge from the frozen mist. The Red Army soldiers began to notice a terrifying pattern. Their officers were being picked off with terrifying accuracy, often before they even heard the report of the rifle. Fear began to spread through the Soviet ranks like a virus, and they started to whisper a name for the invisible phantom that was thinning their numbers. They called him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. The Soviet commanders were furious. They were losing hundreds of men a day to a Finnish force they couldn't even see. To counter the massive Soviet numbers, the Finnish army employed a brutal strategy known as Madi tactics. A Madi is a Finnish word for a cord of wood held together by stakes, and that is exactly what they did to the Russian columns. Using their superior mobility on skis, the Finns would strike the center of a long Soviet convoy, cutting it into isolated stationary pockets. Once trapped, the Soviet soldiers were stuck on the roads, surrounded by deep snow and a forest that seemed to be breathing. Simo Häyhä was the master of these pockets, moving between them like a predator in a high-altitude cage. He would ski miles in the dark to reach a new Madi, positioning himself where the trapped men were most vulnerable. The Soviet soldiers tried to build fires to keep from freezing to death, but a fire was nothing more than a beacon for Simo's iron sights. The orange glow against the blue twilight of the polar night made the target's silhouettes unmistakable. Simo would wait for the moment a soldier reached for a tin of rations or adjusted a log, and then crack. The bullet would find its mark, and Simo would be gone before the snow had even settled back into the trees. The Russians began to react with blind panic, often spraying the tree line with thousands of rounds of machine gun fire at the slightest sound. Simo just laughed silently in his snow hole, knowing that every bullet they wasted was a bullet they wouldn't have for the next day's battle. He started carrying a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun for close-quarters combat, proving he was just as deadly at 10 meters as he was at 400. Reports began to reach the Finnish command that Simo had surpassed 200 confirmed kills in just a few weeks. His superiors were stunned, but for Simo, it was just math: one bullet, one invader, one step closer to a free Finland. He began to refine his camouflage even further, rubbing soot on his face to dull the pale glow of his skin in the moonlight. He even learned to time his shots with the sound of Soviet artillery or the roar of a passing plane to mask the noise of his rifle. But the Red Army was starting to lose its patience with the White Death. They realized that this wasn't just a lucky soldier. It was a specialized threat that required a specialized response. They began to pull their best snipers from other fronts, men trained in the finest schools in Moscow, and sent them into the Kola forest. Their mission was simple: find the man in white and bring back his rifle as a trophy. Simo knew they were coming. He could feel the change in the air, the way the forest went quiet in a different way when a professional was nearby. The game of cat and mouse was about to escalate, and the stakes were no longer just about the war, they were personal. The Soviet High Command had enough of the humiliation. They handpicked their most elite marksmen, men who had been decorated for their precision, and sent them into the frozen hell of Kola with a single objective: kill the White Death. These were not the terrified conscripts Simo had been picking off. These were professionals who knew how to read the wind and hide their own shadows. The forest changed. The air felt heavier, charged with a lethal static, as two sides of the same coin began to hunt one another in the silence. Simo felt the shift immediately. He noticed subtle changes in the environment. A twig snapped in a way no animal would break it, or a patch of snow that looked just a little too deliberate. One afternoon, a Soviet sniper caught a glimpse of Simo's position and fired. The bullet missed Simo's head by mere centimeters, tearing through the heavy wool of his hood. Simo didn't panic. He didn't even move. He lay perfectly still for hours, letting the Russian believe he had found his mark, waiting for the sun to shift and catch the enemy's lens. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, a tiny, brilliant glint appeared near a fallen birch tree 300 meters away. It was the glare of the Russian scope. The very technology Simo had rejected was now acting as a lighthouse, signaling the enemy's doom. Simo adjusted his iron sights, took a breath of freezing air to steady his heart, and fired. The glint disappeared instantly as the Russian sniper fell, defeated by the very glass meant to give him an advantage. But the Soviets didn't stop there. When snipers failed, they turned to the god of war artillery. They began to carpet bomb entire sections of the forest where they suspected Simo was hiding, turning the pristine white landscape into a black, jagged wasteland of splintered wood and fire. During one such barrage, a piece of shrapnel tore through Simo's heavy winter coat, but he remained hunkered down in his snow-filled trench, barely flinching as the world exploded around him. The Red Army was literally trying to kill a single man by destroying the forest he lived in. But Simo was like the wind. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. His kill count was now climbing toward 400, a number so staggering that the Soviet soldiers began to believe he was a supernatural entity, a spirit of the winter sent to punish them. The psychological toll on the invaders was devastating. Men refused to leave their bunkers to relieve themselves. They stopped eating because they were too afraid to light a stove. Simo knew the power of fear. He started leaving calling cards, small adjustments to the environment that let the survivors know he had been there, watching them the whole time. By mid-January, the Russian command realized that their conventional tactics were useless against a man who didn't follow the rules of modern warfare. They were about to launch a desperate final attempt to flush him out. But Simo was already planning his next move, deeper into the heart of the invasion. By late January 1940, Simo Häyhä had been living in a freezer for 2 months. The novelty of the war had long since evaporated, replaced by a grueling daily grind of survival against both the enemy and the elements. The Finnish winter was now at its most unforgiving. To stay still for hours at -40 Celsius is not a feat of training. It is a feat of pure, stubborn will. Simo's boots were stuffed with straw for insulation, and his white camouflage suit was stiff with frozen moisture and the grime of the trenches. His skin was perpetually chapped, and his lungs burned with every intake of the crystalline air, yet his hands never developed the tremors of hypothermia. He had developed a ritual for his equipment. Every night, He would meticulously clean his rifle, ensuring that not a single drop of oil remained in the bolt. Standard lubricants would freeze solid in these temperatures, turning a rifle into a useless club. Simo used a special, thinner oil or sometimes no oil at all to keep the action smooth. His daily routine was a masterclass in discipline. He would wake long before the sun, eat a high-fat meal of salted pork and rye bread, and disappear into the darkness. He didn't just walk into the woods. He skied, using the silent glide of his wooden slats to cover miles of territory without leaving a trail of deep, revealing footprints. The Soviet troops were now suffering from more than just bullets. Scurvy, frostbite, and dysentery were ravaging their ranks. But the fear of the White Death remained the most potent poison. Simo began to notice the Soviet soldiers were becoming more erratic. Some would simply sit in the snow, catatonic, waiting for the end to come. Others would fire blindly into the dark, screaming at the shadows. Simo watched it all through his iron sights, a silent judge in a white robe. He was now averaging 5 to 7 kills a day, every day. On one particularly bloody afternoon, he was credited with 25 kills in a single engagement. Yet, despite the mounting body count, Simo remained remarkably humble. When his comrades praised him, he would simply shrug and say he was doing what he was told. "I only did my duty," he would later say, "and what I was told to do as well as I could." But the constant exposure was beginning to take its toll. The lack of sleep and the perpetual state of high alert were thinning his already slight frame. His eyes, once bright and sharp, were now sunken into his skull, surrounded by the dark circles of exhaustion. He was a man who had become a ghost before he was even dead, a living legend who was slowly being consumed by the very myth he had created. As February approached, the Soviet Union realized that small-scale skirmishes wouldn't work. They began to mass their forces for a final crushing blow against the Kala line. The White Death was about to face a storm of steel and fire, unlike anything he had ever seen, and the odds were finally starting to catch up with him. By March 1940, the Kala River had become a slaughterhouse. The Soviet Union, embarrassed by their lack of progress, unleashed a massive tidal wave of fire, firing tens of thousands of shells into the Finnish lines every single day. The landscape was no longer a forest. It was a lunar wasteland of blackened stumps and craters filled with freezing slush. Simo Häyhä was still there. He was exhausted, his body a map of minor scrapes and frostbite, but he refused to leave the front. He had now reached a staggering 505 confirmed sniper kills, a number that defied military logic and made him the primary target of every Soviet barrel in the sector. On the morning of March 6th, Simo was engaged in a chaotic, close-quarters firefight near the Ulismainen forests. The Soviet troops had finally broken through a section of the line, and the combat turned into a desperate scramble among the ruins of the trees. Simo was using his Suomi submachine gun to hold back a group of advancing soldiers when he spotted a Soviet rifleman in the distance. He dropped to his knee and reached for his bolt-action rifle, the trusty M28 30ths that had served him through the entire winter. But this time, he wasn't the only one who was fast. As Simo aligned his iron sights, a Soviet soldier fired an explosive bulleted projectile designed to detonate on impact directly at the White Death. The bullet struck Simo in the left side of his face, tearing through his cheek and shattering his lower jaw. The force of the explosion was so violent that it flipped him backward into the snow. The lower half of his face was effectively gone. His comrades, seeing him fall, rushed to his side through the whistling bullets and the falling snow. One of the soldiers who picked him up later said that half his head was missing, and they assumed the legend of the White Death had finally come to an end. They carried his limp, blood-soaked body back to the rear, placing him on a pile of other casualties believed to be dead or dying. But Simo Häyhä was a man who had survived -40 Celsius for months. His heart refused to stop beating. A medic noticed a slight movement in the pile of bodies a hand twitching against the frozen earth, and realized the sniper was still breathing. He was rushed to a field hospital and then to a military clinic, where doctors began the impossible task of rebuilding a face that had been shattered by war. Simo fell into a deep, dark coma, unaware that while he lay in a hospital bed, the world was moving on without him. The hunter had finally been hunted, and the finish lines were buckling under the weight of the Soviet machine. For a week, Simo Häyhä drifted in a silent, gray void. In the waking world, the surgeons worked tirelessly, stitching together what remained of his jaw using skin and bone grafts. The White Death was now a patient in a quiet hospital ward, his head wrapped in thick layers of gauze that soaked up the blood and the memories of the Kala River. Then, on March 13, 1940, his eyes fluttered open. The first thing he noticed wasn't the pain, but the silence. The thunder of the Soviet artillery had stopped. The constant rhythmic drumming of the war that had been the soundtrack of his life for 100 days was gone. A nurse stood over him, her face a mask of shock and relief. She told him the news that was echoing across all of Finland. That very morning, a peace treaty had been signed in Moscow. The winter war was over. Simo had woken up on the very day the guns fell silent, as if his body had waited for the conflict to end before returning to consciousness. But the peace came at a heavy price. Finland had held off the giant, but they were forced to cede 11% of their territory, including Simo's home in Karelia. The farm he had fought so hard to protect, the woods where he had hunted as a boy, and the hills where he had earned his nickname were now part of the Soviet Union. Simo couldn't speak. His jaw was wired shut, and the left side of his face was permanently altered, giving him a heavy, drooping expression that some would call the face of war. He took a piece of paper and a pencil, his hand still steady despite the trauma, and wrote a simple question for the doctors. Is the war really over? The nurses wept as they confirmed it. He had done his part, more than any man could be expected to do, but the world he returned to was not the one he had left. The Soviet soldiers, who had survived the muddy traps, were going home, telling stories of a white ghost that couldn't be killed by bullets or bombs. In Finland, Simo was promoted from corporal to second, lieutenant by Field Marshal Mannerheim himself, the greatest jump in rank in the history of the Finnish military. Yet, as he looked at his reflection for the first time, Simo didn't see a hero or a legend. He saw a farmer who had lost his land and a hunter who had become the most hunted man on earth. The recovery was long, painful, and deeply private. For Simo Häyhä, the years following the war were a battle of a different kind of battle, against the mirror and the public eye. He underwent 26 separate surgeries to reconstruct his face. Doctors took bone from his hip to rebuild his jaw, a slow and agonizing process that lasted long after the peace treaty was signed. He became a national icon, a living symbol of sisu, the unique Finnish word for extraordinary determination and grit in the face of impossible odds. Strangers would stop him in the street, and newspapers across the globe clamored for an interview with the White Death. But Simo remained the same quiet farmer he had always been. He often found the attention overwhelming. He was a man of the forest, and the noise of fame was more grating to him than the sound of Soviet gunfire. When asked about his incredible record, he would deflect the praise toward his comrades, insisting that the survival of Finland was a collective effort of every man in the trenches. "I did what I was told to do, as well as I could," he repeated, almost like a mantra to keep the myth from consuming the man. However, the war had left more than just physical scars. Simo received numerous death threats from those who still harbored resentment over the Soviet casualties. He moved frequently, eventually settling back into a life of farming and hunting in southeastern Finland, near the new border. He became a successful dog breeder and a hunter of moose, often accompanied by his loyal friends who knew to never ask him about the winter of 1939. There were moments of irony in his post-war life. Once, he even went hunting with Urho Kekkonen, the president of Finland, who wanted to see the legend in action. Despite his disfigured face, Simo's aim remained legendary. He could still hit a target with a rifle better than men half his age. But the silence of the woods was where he truly felt at home. He would spend weeks alone in the wilderness, far from the medals and the history books. He never married, and he never had children. Some say the war had taken that part of him away, leaving a man who was most comfortable in the company of his dogs and the cold northern wind. As the decades passed, the White Death began to fade into the annals of military history, a story told to new recruits to inspire them. Yet Simo was still alive, a quiet witness to a world that was rapidly forgetting the cost of the freedom he had helped secure. Simo Häyhä lived to see the turn of the millennium, reaching the age of 96. He spent his final years in a veterans' nursing home in Hämeenä, a quiet old man who spent his days looking out the window at the changing seasons. Even in his 90s, his mind remained as sharp as his eyesight once was. He followed the news, watched the world change, and saw the Soviet Union, the empire that had tried to erase his country, eventually crumble and fall. In one of his final interviews, a journalist asked him if he felt any remorse for the lives he had taken during those 100 days in the snow. Simo looked at the reporter with his one good eye and gave a characteristically blunt answer. "I only did my duty and what I was told to do as well as I could. If I hadn't done it, Finland wouldn't exist." It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact from a man who understood that history is often written in the blood of those who refuse to back down. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on April 1st, 2002. He was buried in his hometown of Ruokolahti under a simple headstone that belies the magnitude of his legend. Today, Simo Häyhä is studied in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, not just for his marksmanship, but for his mastery of camouflage, endurance, and psychological warfare. His record of over 500 kills remains the highest for any sniper in a major war, a feat achieved in just 100 days, using nothing more than iron sights and a farmer's patience. The White Death reminds us that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield isn't a tank or a plane, but a single individual with a clear purpose and the sisu to see it through. In a world of high-tech drones and satellite-guided missiles, Simo's story is a haunting echo from a time when a man, a rifle, and a mouthful of snow were enough to stop an empire. Finland remains free today, a testament to the thousands of Simos who stood their ground when the world expected them to fall. If you found this journey into the frozen heart of the Winter War immersive, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more true stories. What would you have done if you were in Simo's place? Let us know in the comments below. Every voice helps keep these legends alive.